to Janet Today, Janet Tomorrow, Janet Forever, the Janet Jackson podcast where two cousins discuss all things Janet Jackson. Today, we are going to talk with a special guest, Ayanna Dozier, author of Janet Jackson's The Velvet Rope for Bloomsbury Publishing's 33 and a Third series, which thoroughly examines Janet's sixth album, The Velvet Rope. My name is Courtney, and I'm here with my cousin.
Cousin Kam.
Hey, Kam, what it do?
Oh, busy. As they say, stretching and surviving.
Okay.
That's how
It's been a minute since I heard your voice. It's good to hear your voice.
Hey, good to hear yours too, cuz.
So we got a full discussion today. I'm so excited about our guest that's coming up.
Yes.
But first, got a few odds and ends we want to talk about in the world of Janet Jackson.
Oh, let's talk about it.
Where you want to start?
Let's talk about this Rolling Stone 500 greatest albums of all time.
Yes.
And you know I'm going to be honest. I like to call it we messed up the first two times. So let's begin. We need more black people. That's what it felt like to me. A lot of movement.
It was a lot of movement. As you alluded to, the first list and had no black women in the top 50 at all. Like no black women on a list about music in the top 50 at all. So they made some adjustments and they rectified that. Some of the major changes were in the top 10, particularly around, those early lists. The Beatles had 4 of the top 10.
Every spot.
Listen, every other spot was the Beatles.
Yes. Don't get me wrong. I like the Beatles. I understand, their history in the music business and the industry, but come on now.
I'm with you. Like, I respect the Beatles, even though Quincy Jones talked bad about them. I respect the Beatles because, if nothing else, they were like a true pop sensation. Like, they were a worldwide pop sensation. So I can't begrudge that. But I will say, probably like 8 years ago. Yeah, probably about 8 years ago, I decided that I wanted to know what the hype was about because the only Beatles songs I ever knew were the ones that En Vogue and Michael Jackson sang.
Yeah.
So I was like, I'm going to learn some Beatles songs. So I just dive deep into the discography. I'm listening to everything. And do you know, it was terrible.
I was not ready. I thought you was going to change my mind.
Not good.
So you wouldn't hear what they were hearing.
There weren't any that I was over the moon for. But again, I respect it because obviously this was a sensation. So I am the anomaly. I am the one who doesn't get it. And I accept that.
Yeah. Did you feel like they were trying too hard with this list?
I thought it was interesting. So we should say how they developed the list.
Yeah. So apparently more than 300 artists, journalists, and industry figures, everyone from Beyonce to Taylor Swift to members of U2 helped determine the all-new list. Voters were asked to submit ranked ballots listing their favorite 50 albums of all time.
Yeah. And then there was some sort of point system. So I guess they were trying to be egalitarian. And I did actually look at the list of people who were solicited. And I'm going to say it was pretty diverse. There could have been some more black people, but I'm going to say for the music industry, it was pretty diverse. Okay. Obviously, we want to talk about the Jacksons and we're going to pause them for a second. But some of the things that I did not expect. So the Beatles were in 4 of the top 10 positions and they were essentially replaced. Not replaced because they still have 2 in the top 10. And then the ones that fell out are still in the top 50. But having them fall out and change places in some cases, did make room for some different folks in the top 10. So now we've got Joni Mitchell in the top 10. We've got Stevie Wonder in the top 10, Prince in the top 10, and Lauryn Hill in the top 10 with the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. And then at number 1, we have Marvin Gaye, What's Going On.
I have no problem with the number 1 being Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, because I still listen to cuts off of that whole collection, that whole album. I don't know why we had to redo a list to get him to number 1.
Yeah.
The thing that stood out to me, and the reason why I felt like they was trying a little bit too hard, was if you go past the top 10, there was some albums in there that I was like, ain't no way. You know what I'm saying? Like, for instance, with Kanye and Dark Twisted was like in the top 50, where I felt College Dropout should have been higher than that one. So it was like, I respect the list, but there was a couple of them I was like, man, a couple of these rap albums, I felt like trying too hard, doing too much.
What's interesting is like, from what I understand, people just got to like name whatever was on their mind. So like,
okay.
Every album was available. And so I think when that happens, like it is going to be kind of a collection of like whatever is top of mind, right? Like if you ask me to write down my 50 favorite albums, I may not actually get my 50 favorite. It may be the 50 I can remember at that time.
Yeah.
So I think there's a little give and take. But let's talk about the Jacksons.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Jacksons. I'm gonna let you go first because I'm gonna be a griper.
Maybe I'll let you go first.
All right.
Give their positions first.
Okay. Coming in at number 12 is the Mr. Michael Jackson with Thriller. 36, Michael again with Off the Wall. Janet comes in at 111 with Control. Then we have 194 with Michael J with Bad. Then all the way at the bottom at 318 is Janet with The Velvet Rope. And 339, Janet again with Rhythm Nation, 1814.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you know where I'm going with my gripe yet?
Perhaps, yes, but do tell.
Okay. My gripe is, of course, my favorite Janet project and era, Janet period. I didn't see it. Did I overlook it in the top 5 in 500 albums? Nobody throw that out there?
I don't think so, hon. I don't think it's there.
This list don't mean nothing, dear.
This list is dead to you.
This list is dead because you got to have that on there, man. You got to. There wouldn't be a Velvet Rope without a Janet.
I was going to ask you if you thought Janet's list was in the right order, but not only do you not think they're in the right order, you don't even think it's the right albums.
I think I'm okay with Control being at 111, but now somewhere in between now, you got to wait 207 albums before you mention her again. Put some respect on the name.
It's a little wild. I will say,
wow.
Yeah, so the list, it's really hard to search this list, so I hope I'm getting it right. But I believe in 2012, she had The Velvet Rope was on there, and I think The Velvet Rope might have been the only album on there in 2012. I feel like Rhythm Nation had to be on there, but I couldn't find it. So the one I could find was Janet Jackson's Velvet Rope, and it was in at number 259, and that was in 2012. So I was like, man, this really took a tumble in 2020. Like, what's really going on?
Yeah. And then as far as Michael goes, you know how I feel about Off the Wall. So to me, Off the Wall could have been 12 and Thriller could have been 36.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I
love Off the Wall, man. It's a classic.
People hate on Thriller a little too much for me, though, because I feel like the Thriller is solid front to back, with the exception of Thriller.
Oh, I can't stand that song. Around Halloween, I'm gonna tell the Thriller song why I don't like Thriller. Around Halloween.
Yeah, so I feel like it's a solid entry, and considering that album still, I think if we look right now, it's probably still in the top 200 on the Billboard. So you can't say anything bad about Thriller.
Right.
So yeah, I don't mind it, but I was a little surprised that Velvet Rope and Rhythm Nation were down so low. But I mean, everybody can't be at the top, and I think it's important to have her on this list. And I always go back and forth about like how much weight, how much gravity do you give these types of things, because they have been notoriously discriminatory of people of color and any traditionally marginalized communities. But I do think it's important because, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later with Ayanna, I do think it's so important because these types of lists, like 40 years from now, these are the types of lists where somebody might look back and try to really understand who were the tastemakers, who were the trendsetters of this time of the 20th century. Or wait, we're in the 21st century now, whatever century, right? And so to be omitted from those lists means that people in the future don't really know your impact, but also they don't get to discover you. And so I do think it's important to expand that canon and to include the voices that really shaped music of this time, not the voices that really shaped music of this time for a very particular and slim demographic.
Right.
Cold white guys. Right?
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
What else? We have one more thing to talk about before we get to Ayanna. What
the Billboard Awards nomination, and our girl Janet, she received one. Can you guess what it is?
Yo, I know what it is, and I gotta tell you, I didn't even know this was a category.
Dang it, I knew you were gonna say that. I didn't either. And I have a confession. I didn't know that there was a nomination for a top R&B tour. And her competition is B2K and Khalid, who I didn't know Khalid went on tour. And I thought B2K was 3 years ago. But hey, don't blame me because I haven't watched the Billboard Awards since 2018 when Janet received her award.
Listen,
sorry.
So I was like, when did she go on tour? You know, this pandemic is throwing, like, my space-time continuum is all messed up. I was like, when did she tour? So is it for State of the World or is it for the residency Metamorphosis? Do you know?
That I'm not for sure. Because like I said, I didn't know they gave her an award.
Well, whatever it's for, I hope she wins.
If she can't beat B2K and Khalid, something wrong.
You know what though? I'm not even gonna trip. B2K, do you remember how people acted when they announced that Millennium Tour?
Oh yeah.
People lost their mind for the B2K. And
then they had that little drama too that was really selling tickets because it was like, are they gonna perform together?
Be there. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I wouldn't even be mad if they win it. I will say though, I'm just super excited because like it's 2020. This woman went on her first tour in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
Or 89, 90. Mm-hmm. So I mean, to be in the top 3 for, contender for this award, like, let's not minimize that. So win, awesome. But just as they say, to be in the room, right? I'm excited about it. Even though I didn't know it existed. But now I am. Now that I know it exists, I'm excited. So
you know what this kind of reminds me of? When you go to them company functions and they have a raffle and then they like, just pick up a ticket. Pick up a ticket. So you pick it up and then they had a door prize and you win. You eat your chips and you go, oh, I won. Right. Janet might be like, oh, for that time, I won? Okay.
No, I needed a juicer, but I'm excited.
Hey, take that juicer to the house.
All right. Let's get to our guest. Today, we are going to talk with our special guest, Ayanna Dozier. She is a filmmaker, performance artist, and scholar. Ayanna is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at McGill University. Adjunct professor in the Department of Communications and Media Studies at Fordham University, Rose Hill, and a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow with the Whitney Museum of American Art. We've invited Ms. Dozier here today because in addition to that long list of impressive credentials, she's written a book about Janet Jackson's landmark work titled Janet Jackson's The Velvet Rope for Bloomsbury Publishing's 33 1/3 series. My name is Courtney and I'm here with my cousin
Kam. Welcome to the podcast, Ayanna.
Hi, thank you.
Just want to welcome you to the podcast. We got a lot of things that we want to discuss with you. Let me just say this. This was a great read for me. What I love about this book was it took me back to the Velvet Rope era and how much has changed from then to now. You covered so many things in this book that we want to talk to you about. But first, what made you want to write about Janet's Velvet Rope era?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, thank you both for inviting me on. Yeah, I'm extremely grateful and also excited to speak with genuine fans of Janet's career. I think some of the press has been, just distant observers of, oh, I like music culture, but there's just such a different energy of people who know the artist. There's so many reasons why I wanted to write this book. And I wanted to write the book even before I became aware of the 33 and a Third series that allows these kind of semi-deep engagements with music culture history via an album. I think I first started to recognize the effect that the Velvet Rope had on my life when I became a teenager. I didn't have the vocabulary that I have now, but I started to realize or just become aware that, wow, in the same way in which, books, certain types of really quote unquote important artworks that, like Michelangelo, all of that stuff that we look at and say, oh, that's important. I too was like, wait, this album has altered the trajectory of my life. I make different decisions, or I'm beginning to make different decisions because of this album, because of the vocabulary about what it means to be me as a young Black woman growing up in the world, and as a queer young Black woman growing up in the world, that I was already starting to kind of make different decisions that I probably would have not made had I not listened to that album intensely. And I wanted to explain that to people. When I first started my graduate degrees in 2012, 2013, that's when I started to publish and write criticism on pop culture. And that's when that kind of instinct came back to me of, oh, I should say something about the Velvet Rope, especially at that period in the early 2000s before she came back with Unbreakable. That period, which I like to call the Dark Ages.
Accurate.
Janet was ostracized. She was still blacklisted. You had to justify Janet's iconicity. And so many people, especially in academia, were unwilling to concede of her impact. And I think in kind of concluding that question, that was another influence, is the fact that coming from an academic perspective, there are so many academic articles on Madonna, which I get. Yes. There's, I think, maybe one peer-reviewed article on Janet Jackson. It's insane. And I think that's what kind of gave me the influence of thinking, okay, I have to find a way to remind people, because I was starting to see it in real time, that sense of forgetfulness emerge.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. Okay, you have sparked so many things inside. But the first thing I want to say is just thank you, because one of the things you hit on is one of the things that I'm super passionate about, and that is almost the erasure of her in real time.
Yeah.
And I was telling Kam, I was like, there should be 35 books about Janet Jackson.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful that you took the time to not only, we hear the passion, this is coming from a place of passion, but we also hear you felt like this was worthy for the Academy. We need to record this legacy in academia, because this is a person, a persona, a career, a legacy worth study, worth preserving.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that, because she's been a trailblazer in so many ways for so many people, yet you still, to this day, last week, there was the argument about her impact, about her legacy. There was the conversation about Swiss Beats and, with verses. Someone had put into the atmosphere, perhaps there should be a verses with Janet Jackson and Missy Elliott. And personally, I don't think there should be, for a host of reasons.
Yeah.
But none of the reasons were that she didn't have enough hits to do it, which is the position that Swiss Beats put up, which is stunning to me, because for someone to consider themselves a titan of the music industry, one would think that, one, you would aim to preserve the legacy of your fellow Black musicians, but also two, that you would know your history. You would know the history of music. And so I appreciate this, because now it's it can become canon, right? We are on our way. It takes one, and then there will be more down the road. But this was just so well done. I wanted to I wanted to ask you about kind of those early days. So you came to Janet Jackson really early.
Yeah.
That you were 7,
Yeah.
and somehow you had finagled your way into getting your mother to take you to the store to buy the velvet rope at 7. So kudos to you. But I want to fast forward because you say something in this book that I have so many favorite lines, but you say something here, which is basically the very last line, I think, of the work, which is the velvet rope gave me a voice, and it made and continues to make my work and my life, along with so many others, possible. And I want to harken back to a story you told earlier, if you're, well, obviously you're willing to share it. You wrote it in the book. Right. I wanted to talk about, you talked about the song Free Zone and how years after you had first heard that song, it essentially rescued you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Oh, goodness. So that's been an interesting thing about what I reveal about my own life in the book, is in terms of using anecdotes, personal anecdotes as an entryway to, I think, ground a lot of the concepts. Because it is, I am an academic, but it is a more accessible piece of writing for me. But there's a lot of theory there. And I use myself as a way to remind people, like, this is real. So when I talk conceptually, like, it affects people's lives. And I didn't go into writing that with the intention to talk, and I don't think I talk about myself a lot, but with the intention to talk about the way certain things in my life in that way. So I mean, you're absolutely right. I wrote it. So like, I'm going to have to talk about it, but there are things in there that I haven't talked to my friends about, for example, and it just came out of me. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm comfortable sharing this with everyone then. So with that anecdote, it was something that I felt would be useful, because one element of the velvet rope, I cannot overstate this enough, especially coming from Black culture, especially coming from that transition period of Black respectability politics in the 20th century. Like Janet coming out and being very, not just an ally of queer culture, because a lot of artists were doing that in the late 90s, but also saying, I myself could be queer. Like, she purposefully blurs the line of her own sexual attraction on that album. And that was risky, but it was useful because, and I was thinking of an interview she gave, I think for BET, where she states, I'm doing this because I know a lot of my fans and a lot of the women in my life also have this. And so, like, if I can insert myself as a stand-in for them, like that I'm helping them out. Like I'm kind of drawing attention to ways of living that are actually quite normal for a lot of people in terms of queer expression. And that meant a lot to me in kind of becoming aware of my own queerness at a very, very young age. And I think listening to the album the first time, my mother had kind of omitted some songs. She had, I think I remember vividly, we came home from Sam Goody in November 1997, and we had this huge sound system. So we immediately put it on. And most of the songs are fine up until speakerphone. And that's when you're like, that's when you're like, uh-oh. And I remember that my mother was in the kitchen and that came off, and she like darts to the sound system, and she's like, no. She's like, I have to actually listen to this, before we can just play it. And so she then took it to her room, and then she came back and she was like, here are the songs that I think are like, okay. And I believe Free Zone was one of them. And I just don't think she like really got it. And and as a young kid, I didn't get it either. I was like, oh yeah, it's about like dancing or something. And so when I was kind of when my family realized that, I was attracted to the same gender, I kind of went back to that, and then suddenly it made sense. And I also, I think I'm quite open in the book that, you know, memory is weird. So sometimes we misremember things, but sometimes we just have that instinct, that feeling of this is what felt true to me at that time. And that's what I remember listening to it after that moment around 11, 12, just being, wow, like here's someone affirming my existence in the world as a queer woman in ways that weren't available to me elsewhere. And that really did become a grounding point for me for several years thereafter.
So one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book, so like you state right off the bat that this is a Black feminist literature, like you are doing a study of this from that lens. But the thing I love is it's so accessible. So when I first saw that this book was going to be published and that you were the author, I was super excited. Number one, obviously, because we need more Janet Jackson books, but it was important to me that we have a Black woman to do this work, to kind of do this early work and kind of set the stage, and that you did. What I love is that there is almost kind of a play-by-play of each song. Like there is a real critical analysis of each song, and not just the songs, but how they fit into the context of the world that we were weaving and how they fit into the context of the journey of Janet's trajectory for her album. And also, I just want to give people, I want to give them like a how-to guide for this book. Listen to the songs, man, because each song that you talk about, when I went back and listened, there was so many layers that I missed. Or maybe that I didn't miss. Maybe that I had missed the samples, like your knowledge about the individual samples that are on the songs. I ended up listening to so many 70s funk songs because of you calling out the various samples that are a part of this album. So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about, one, the structure of the book, why it is the way that it is, and then how you went about putting it together.
Yeah. So I read the 33 1/3 book series, and they don't really have a set guideline, which is on one hand really great when you're a reader, but then when they say, hey, we're going to give you this opportunity, you're like, oh wait, I have to do this by myself in some extent. So I felt like I wanted to pull out what I always thought worked best in that series. And I really liked the 33 1/3 that gave me not just historical information and not just personal information, but also gave me a new insight into the album, like into the songs themselves. And some of them don't always do that. Some of them just look at the hits, the singles, and miss out on the kind of the other tracks that can make it up and make up its uniqueness. And I wanted to ensure that I paid close attention to the songs on the album. And when I made that decision, I then had to figure out structure-wise, you know, what did that look like? Am I just gonna like break it up chapters, like here are the first 4 songs, and then chapter 2 is like tracks like 5 through this, and I realized that wouldn't be productive. That would maybe be quite stale, and so I kind of sat for a while thinking, okay, how can I conceptually organize this and find themes that allow people to hold on to a concept and then take that concept and apply it to these different tracks. And I realized that while there are many stories that can be told about the Velvet Rope, that there are essentially 4 dominant ones that hold in about 16 tracks, with a few of the interludes spilling over, where we have a kind of real question of confronting the past, confronting yourself, and that appears in several tracks. We have a real consideration of just depression, of melancholy, of being disconnected or alienated from others. We have a very intense engagement around sexuality. And then we have songs that are kind of organized around possibility, around emancipation even, around just freedom And that freedom, although we look at the Velvet Rope and we don't think of it as her most political work, but I think it is actually, but it's a personal freedom. It's a freedom from the self. It's a freedom from the past even. And so I was able to kind of listen through the album and group the songs together in those 4 arrangements. And I start with the hardest parts of the listening and engagement, and then end with that sense of possibility, being what we last listened to.
Yeah. And I can't imagine what it's like to sit down at that white space and figure out how to organize your thoughts around this work, but it works so well. So I appreciate you breaking it down for us. And I would encourage anyone who's reading this book, get the book, get the album, get yourself a cup of coffee, or in my case, I had kombucha. Sit down and enjoy it, because it's really a readable book. And that's what I want people to take away is, like, sometimes people think of these works, if a scholar is involved at all, like your PhD candidate. So if a scholar is involved at all, then it's a textbook. And that is not what this is. It's very readable, but it does offer some very critical insights in this album, and basically just using what was available to you. So, because you mentioned that there aren't really any specific interviews for this work. This was a lot of archival studies, watching interviews, and using very specifically Janet's own words in this book to kind of help us to understand how it was received then, which I think is so important, but also what does it mean? What should it mean for us today?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to, because YouTube is such a great tool to remind us of what was. And while there's a lot of conceptual research, I wanted individuals, after reading it, to not only go back to the album or to listen to the album beforehand, but I kind of also wanted that fan participation of like, oh, what did she say when she was talking to Oprah? And like trying to look that up and re-experiencing that for themselves as well.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that in the electronic copy that I have, most of the notes and references are hyperlinked. So if you refer to an article or an interview that's available on the web, the link is right there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of the things that stood out with this book was you talk about how not only did the Velvet Rope shock America mainstream, but the Black conservatives were a little taken back by this Janet. What was it about her being open about oppression, sexuality, and abuse? Why wasn't America ready for this Janet?
Yeah, because that Janet and that type of honesty is not a space that we make available to women in society. So we're actually quite comfortable with women expressing their sexuality insofar as it's centered around pleasing men. We get offended when women assert their sexuality for their own pleasure. Like when it's about them centering their needs. We get offended then when we have women express their sexualities in ways that don't center men and maybe center women. So I think that's a clear line to draw, because while her previous album, Janet, was, I wouldn't say controversial, but rather, was provocative. It caused a stir. But because so much of that album, and this is not a critique, but because so much of that album is about her, in a healthy monogamous relationship and about like pleasing her man, a lot of that worked well. Like it was provocative in the right way, of the way in which we can be like, oh, what a scandal. But culturally we can affirm and get behind. And the Velvet Rope breaks that, because she not only begins to center herself, but she also, what I think does is very, has always been culturally taboo. And I think specifically if we go to the roots of Black conservative culture, is to talk about abuse and abuse for Black women and Black women's sexuality has always been the thing that we keep silent about. And this is as old as, not time, but as old as Reconstruction following slavery. One of the bargaining points was that we were willing to sacrifice Black women to get ahead, that if there's so much pain we can deal with in being abused, being lynched, and being attacked, and being literally new political laws being written up to keep us oppressed, the prison system coming after slavery, that prisons didn't really exist in the United States before slavery, but they were invented to keep individuals in that position of subjugation. And Angela Davis writes about that. So that's not just me spitballing, like that's actual historical fact. That if all of these things were happening, one of the consensus that kind of was made was that, well, we'll sacrifice Black women in order to kind of keep ahead and to keep the argument simplified. And so that meant then at the early 20th century, during this period of new music invention, where jazz comes about, where there becomes a clear split from the church, secular music, the devil's music, all of that stuff, it's all new for Black Americans. And Janet really did something different there by naming her abuse, not just domestically, but internal, her inner saboteur even. And that's just not something that we've ever made publicly available for Black women. That's the thing that most Black women, especially Black women coming in the 20th century, we would hear in their autobiography right before they died. You know, that's the conversation you get with Oprah, with like Tina Turner at the age of like 60, right? Like you don't get that when they're in their late 20s, early 30s.
And at the height of their career.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think too, you expressed the sentiment multiple times in the book where basically people did not want to hear about Black people's pain. People do not want to hear about Black women's pain specifically.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, there was this sentiment in the time when The Velvet Rope was released that Janet didn't have a right to these stories, whether it was about the Depression. She can't be depressed. She's rich.
Yeah.
Or whether it was about like these kind of what we would consider more provocative sexual escapades, like not Lil Penny. She's making this up. This is a character that she's wearing for this album. One of the things that I love that you touch on in this book, and not just touch on, but like you hold on to it like a kitten with her favorite toy, is how prone we are to revising history and how quickly it happens, especially in our new digital world.
Yeah.
Now, years later, we consider The Velvet Rope just a groundbreaking masterpiece. But its initial reception by mostly white men was lukewarm at best.
Yeah.
In your book, you call attention to David Ritz's Rolling Stone interview with Janet for The Velvet Rope. And he's talking about the reception of the album. And he just flat out says she got her ass kicked. Her metaphors are misunderstood. Word was she was into bondage or she was depressed. They said the album wasn't selling. They said the tour was bombing. The press was hostile. For the first time in Janet's career, downright mean.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because you have that, what we know happened and what we all lived through. And now, if you read a review of The Velvet Rope, everything was roses. It was the best thing ever created.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about what was happening then and why your perspective of why the reception was what it was. And then what's happened now that has caused people to go back and kind of take a second look at The Velvet Rope.
Yeah, that's great question. I'm glad you draw attention to that. How we remember things is usually through a media object. A lot of us didn't live through World War II, but we remember the war, and we remember the war because of film. So I say that then because when we have our media object as something that's always changing and/or that's always being able to be erased and new information added on, that does make our understanding of what happened suspect, actually. Before even The Velvet Rope, Rhythm Nation wasn't actually well received.
Mm-hmm.
It did well commercially. All of those #1 hits, not just the top 7, but she had 4 #1 singles. Yeah. And then with the exception of All Right, all of the other singles were #2. Like, that's insane. Mm-hmm. But that's the commercial reception. The critical reception was that she was trying too hard. And I remember it's 1990 or 1991 where Janet, she won an award for Rhythm Nation. She brought out these 2 young girls who were inspired to go back and get their GED. And she reads a review where this like white woman was like, oh, the Rhythm Nation video is black and white. It's trying to be serious. What does she think she's going to do? Dance her way into a revolution? And, you know, Janet's like obviously disgusted, but she reads it out and she's like, well, look at this. Like, look at this effect that media can actually shape people's lives. So I'm highlighting that to also reassess our understanding of Janet's career. I think a lot of her criticism has always been a little harsh, but I think that the Velvet Rope then already battling against kind of black respectability, let alone then putting that into white dominant space. A lot of the white men who kind of especially became fans of her only after Janet really were really wanting a sequel to that, you know, like, yeah, talk more about, you know, pleasuring us, or talk more about that. Give us that fantasy of a woman who doesn't have an interiority, who actually doesn't have a life beyond pleasing men. Even still in 2020, you know, I can name many movements. I always hate defaulting to Me Too, but it's common, people know it. But if anything about Me Too has shown us is that men still have a hard time listening to women and understanding the boundaries of consent. And I think the criticism and backlash to Janet for the Velvet Rope is a clear demonstration of that, of just a refusal to actually listen to women. Mm-hmm. I think in the 20 years plus since its release, I think what has happened is that a lot of criticism has changed. I think you have a lot more diversity, but you also have a lot more diversity, not just in like racial and gender representation, but literally in just what counts as music criticism, like BuzzFeed. And what that has done then, it has broken up the hierarchy of music criticism. And so that's where you then get all of these very diverse voices writing back like 20 years later, the Velvet Rope is iconic. It paved the way for Lemonade. And it's that type of publishing then that allows people to go back to Wikipedia and then say, oh, actually, and shape this narrative that the Velvet Rope has been well received all along.
I've listened to the Velvet Rope millions of times. I never looked at the reason why it wasn't well perceived was because Janet wasn't stroking the male ego.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow. You know what I'm saying? and I know this is kind of off subject, but like with sexuality, like me and my friends, you know, my homeboys, when we talking, you know, sport, women and everything else, oh, it's cool for me to talk about my same-sex relationship.
Right.
But if I talk about male on male, then it's like red flags all up.
Right.
But if I'm talking about women and women together, oh, that's the ultimate male fantasy. And so I'm just like, wow, how much of stroking a man's ego is relevant into music today. So now I'm probably gonna write a whole paper just thinking about how that all plays together, for real.
It does all tie together, because I was just thinking about, you know, just kind of the reception of Megan Thee Stallion.
Yeah.
And I think it's because she does not censor men in her discussions, and it's very hard for people to see women as autonomous and as agents of their own body and agents of their own pleasure and agents of their own desire. Like, we are to be subjected to the desires of the men that we are with, not our own, right? Yeah. And so it's very interesting for me to watch kind of the duplicity of, especially in Black culture, because that's where you see the arguments about Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion, and you know, and the tendency is always to juxtapose them with others that they could be more like, right? Like it's, you know, Meg Thee Stallion could be No Name, or she could be Meg Thee Stallion. Like she's seems to be doing pretty well with what she's chosen. But it's like people, particularly in the Black community, expect women to project this need to be desired by others, and in order to be desired by men, we must conform. And when we don't conform, they're kind of angry that they're still attracted. Like
yes, and that with just a little bit on Meg Thee Stallion. I think I appreciate Cardi B, so that this is no disrespect to her at all. But in WAP, Meg Thee Stallion has, I think, the smarter lyrics, where she talks about like, you know, I'm going to use you to get my education. And then she has one of a really, really impactful lyric, and maybe we'll like fully recognize it 10 years from now. But she says, you know, like when I write it, and he asked me whose it is, I'm going to spell my own name. And I'm just like, yes. Like it's cleverly stated, but it's also, again, that autonomous, like I can enjoy this and I can recognize that you might enjoy this too. Like this is for me. And that's also because of literally, like I go back to slavery because, you know, we're not done with slavery yet. If a system of 400 plus years of subjugation, and it's not even been 200 years, like it still has something to say about how we understand ourselves. So I say this then because it doesn't surprise me that we as a society have such a hard time when Black women assert autonomy over their body, because we literally were subjugated without the autonomy of our bodies. Like that was the whole point of slavery, was that we didn't possess our bodies, and that then slavery would be reproduced through our bodies without our consent.
Yeah, it was our main selling feature. So
yeah.
Even with Janet being, you know, coming out of her shell with the Janet period and coming out with Velvet Rope, people were so uncomfortable. What was it about the Velvet Rope that really made them more uncomfortable, even though sex was involved? She was doing it still classy.
Yeah.
I love when Janet fans say that. And Janet says it too, that she's like, I think her quote is, I feel what I do has class to it. And
that's in relation to Madonna.
Hey, I tell people all the time.
I was like, no, it's wild. It's very wild. Just own it.
Especially like when you listen to things like Throb, or even the B-side from the Janet era, 70s love song.
Yeah, wow. Ma'am.
That's still like one of the nastiest songs I've ever heard. And I'm like, okay, but classy. Okay.
Okay, you say so.
Yeah, I think maybe how you begin that question, Kam, is, so I feel like there's a difference between, like, it's not sex is flat, because sex is not flat. Sex is multidimensionary in all of our experiences, but it is flattened in society. It's largely like centered around heterosexuality, and centered around men having agency and women being objects of desire. And I think, again, with the Janet period, I love that album, and I don't think she was like making something to be like, I want men to like me. Like, I don't think she was trying to quote unquote play into that role. I just think that by default of like that being her quote unquote sexual awakening and her being in a monogamous relationship with a man, that it inevitably fulfills that. That's all. And that her expression of sexuality then just was comfortably fit into heterosexuality and the dominance of that representation in society. The Velvet Rope very differently goes against that, because it introduces BDSM, it introduces consent, like just stop, and that's actually not something part of heterosexual culture. Again, the Velvet Rope differs from the Janet album because she introduces that as a starting point, and she introduces different types of sexual engagements. She actually adds depth to sex, and that's not something that we've ever been comfortable with in society. And I think still to this day we struggle with it. We actually, as a society, we don't want the detail, we don't want the depth, we just want the surface. And when women break that, and when women assert autonomy, we have to push back against that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Well, now this is my last thing, because I was taking notes for this, and I like the Velvet Rope. It's like in my top 3 of Janet albums. I'm just going to say top 3. Reading your work made me think of, like, Janet was giving us something that was timeless. And now, fast forward to 2020, you have so many people come back to this project, and they take little bits and pieces of what they discovered about themselves. And I think you did a great job with that, with just letting us know as a reader the journey of Janet, and gives us another reason why we should appreciate the work. So I just want to give you kudos and just say once again, anybody has a chance to pick it up and read it, they should. It's definitely a journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Jumping off of what Kam said in final thoughts, that I can't overstate enough that while we're slowly crawling out of that misrecognition of Janet's influence or impact in society, that she really did give us a type of intervention on Black womanhood. And in saying that, the particular backlash against her following Super Bowl 2004 is a real travesty, because it really tried to erase our memory of that impact. And I think, again, we're coming out of that, but, there's a good 10 plus years where, it was like the forbidden name to speak, and how that robbed so many women trying to make sense of themselves in society. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just that.
Yeah. So I did want to say that personally for me, reading your book really opened my eyes and reminded me why I love Janet Jackson. To be quite honest, I am a Janet Jackson fan that does not listen to Janet Jackson a lot, right? Like, so if you scroll through my phone, you'll see Leanne LaHavish, you'll see Moonchild, you'll see No Name. But when Janet Jackson comes on, like, I have to listen. Like, if it's in the store, I got to stay the whole song. But it's been a while since I intentionally sat down with the Velvet Rope. And so I have to thank you for that, because your perspective, your insight really reminded me of the power of Janet Jackson. And the reason Kam and I started this podcast is because it was just important to us that we get on record the legacy of Janet Jackson.
Yeah.
And being able to talk to her fans and get them on record, and being able to talk with her collaborators and get them on record. And it's just two Black women in closets on opposite ends of the United States, right? But our goal was really just because no one else was doing it.
Yeah.
And so we're so grateful to you for doing it right.
Yes. Thank you.
For doing this work and for lifting up her name. And I think if we don't preserve us, no one will. And so I'm just so thankful to you for doing that and taking us through the album with a more critical lens, but also a loving lens, because obviously you're a fan as well. So I just appreciate that. And I want to close. I want to ask you to say a little bit about my favoriteest line in your book. And it is this. You say, the ambiguity on the Velvet Rope is so integral in helping listeners navigate uncertainty. What does that mean?
And I think I believe that line is in relationship to some of the criticism of like, oh, be clearer if you're going to talk about, being sad.
Yeah.
Give us everything.
Why are you sad? We need details.
Yes.
Are you gay? We need specifics.
Yes. And she was like, no, if I'm going to tell you I'm sad, and I'm going to do it in this other way, this poetic way, this almost experimental way. I think the Velvet Rope still is her most, just like, let alone the topics and themes on the album, it's her most like diverse album sonically. Like, there's a lot of different sounds on it. There's a lot of different genres and styles, and it really is an album that like frees your body and allows your body to respond in different ways. And with that being said, that experimentation in every form, in the production, in the songwriting, in the music videos, in the interviews, was productive. It wasn't just a type of experimentation that leads to ambiguity or unclarity because she didn't know what she was doing. Like, it wasn't one of those elements, but rather I know that if I say enough but then hold back here, that the people listening will, one, be able to hear it. And I think also, if we go back to the themes on the album, domestic violence. And if you listen to any of the interviews of that era, she doesn't actually talk about that song, What About? She talks about it many years later in different interviews, but she doesn't talk about it during that time period. But she alludes to it in some of the interviews. And what that does is it allows it to be accessible. So she delivers it for a wider audience And she knows that she's given just enough information for the women who need to hear that to hear it, while everyone else who may not be keyed into that vocabulary, keyed in to what she's saying, won't also be completely dismissive about it. So that ambiguity opens up a lot of the interpretation of the album. And I think it also, for a lot of queer individuals, it not only made the queerness more explicit for them, myself included, but I think also in the question of gender identity. And I think I used Janet Mock as an example. That ambiguity is what helped afford her the opportunity to come into herself, you know, as a trans woman in the world, even though there's no lyric about that whatsoever, but it's the ambiguity there. And I think that that's not only a testament to Janet's cleverness as a songwriter, as a producer, as a conceptual artist, as a performer, but it's also her awareness that there are certain things that don't need to be outright stated, even though I am stating them, but that can be organized differently. So that way I have this massive platform to do the work, and then the people who need to hear it can hear it and do what they need to do with it.
Love that. That's perfect. We're going to leave it right there. Leave it right there. Okay. So before we go, Ayanna, will you tell us how can people get your book?
Absolutely. So the preferred way is to purchase the book directly via Bloomsbury.com. And you can purchase it in a variety of formats, hardcover, not hardcover, but paperback, e-publishing edition, or a PDF edition. If you cannot purchase it directly there, and I think that might be an international issue outside of the UK and the United States and Canada, you can publish it via Barnes & Noble, which does have a global outpost. And so those are the preferred ways. For those who are located in New York City, you can publish it in person or in person via the Strand bookstore and Barnes & Noble.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I just would encourage anyone who is a Janet Jackson fan, a music history fan, feminist, Black person, a woman, adult or child, get this book. It's so good.
All people.
It's so good.
Everybody.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us. And we really just wish you all the best in your continued studies. And we hope there's more to come from you. We'll be following.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. This was such an enjoyable conversation. I really appreciate it.
That is it for us for now. If you need more Janet Jackson, which we know you need more Janet Jackson, you can subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
If you're already a subscriber, please tell a Janet Jackson fan about us and leave us a rating or review whenever you're listening. Your comments and ratings help other people find us, especially on iTunes.
If you're not already, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Janet Jackson Pod. If you are following, thank you for every like and every single retweet, especially on episode releases. Those are simple things you can do, and they go a long way to help us reach new Janet Jackson fans.
Our intro and outro music, Good For You, is provided by THBD and is licensed under the Creative Commons 3.0 license.
Thanks for listening to Janet Today, Janet Tomorrow, Janet Forever.
Very like, and I'm just like, oh. And so what happens with those interviews is you have to do a lot more setup, and I kind of like,
you're talking to her people here. It's so funny because I can remember I was in college, so we're older. We're older, but older than you. I was in college when the Velvet Rope came out. It was like my first semester of college, and I remember I went to school in Iowa, Ames, Iowa.
Ooh.
And there was one record store that, occasionally the Walmart had Black music, but there was one record store, and it was in walking distance. So that album came out at midnight, and I got up, put on my clothes, and walked to the record store to get the Velvet Rope. And then I came back to my dorm and stayed up all night listening to the Velvet Rope. So for me to have listened that intently and I don't know that I listened to anything else for a very long time.
Right.
and for me to be finding these new insights while reading your book, it was just a thrill. It was an absolute thrill.
Oh, I'm so grateful for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.